thing. And we're going to start. I want to go into the end times, and I finally cracked a scripture that I have been wrestling with for decades, and so I'm pretty excited about sharing it with you tonight. And it has to do with the end times. And I have an email list, and I kicked a chart out to everybody that I have an email for. So if you're on this call and you did not get a chart in the email today, then please, if you want to be in email touch with me, then please email me in the next day or two, and I'll put you on the email list so that you have it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to bring up the chart. And well, let me tell you where I'm going first of all, so we'll know kind of the end game here. If you want to go to Zechariah, I know that all of you read Zechariah every day. It's one of those really cool books. But it's a really, really fun book. So Zechariah, what happened here? Somehow or other. Wait a minute. Zechariah. There we go. Good deal. Okay, in Zechariah chapter 14, there is a very interesting verse in verse 6 and 7. And remember, verse markings were added, much later than the Bible was written. But it's talking, and we'll go back and pick up the whole context here, but I just want to show you where we're going. In Zechariah 14, talking about the day that is ending the Battle of Armageddon. We don't know how long the Battle of Armageddon will take, whether it's several days, whether it's a week, whether somehow or other Christ can get it done in a day. We're not really sure. But in any case, as we begin to get to the end of the Battle of Armageddon, it says in verse 6, it will happen in that day that there will not be light, cold, or frost. Verse 7, it will be a unique day that is known to Yahweh, not day and not night. But it will come to pass that at evening or evening time there will be light. So it's a it's a day that's there's not light, there's not cold, there's not frost, there's not day, there's not night. It's a unique day, and that's a very interesting word when it says it's a unique day. And if you notice the English translations, they basically all read that way because that's exactly what the Hebrew means. It means it's a unique day, and then it makes the statement that it's known only to Yahweh. And that doesn't mean, obviously, that the day is known only to Yahweh, because he just tells us about it. It's that exactly what he's going to do and how he's going to do it is unknown. But I think what has happened is we've studied the end times now literally for decades. I think, well, yeah, all of 1990, I'd say close to 2 decades, as I've studied the end times. It finally just within the last week or 10 days, this verse opened up to me as what's going on. So with that, that's kind of the introduction and where we're going. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen, and let's do an overview of the end times. Let's see. And I think, okay, y'all can see that now, that chart?
Yep.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, and can you see my cursor over it?
Yes.
Okay, so here we are. If we're over here on left of chart, then and I'm going to move this over where it's easier for me to see. Did I move that off my screen, or can you still see it?
Can still see it.
Okay, good. Yay, praise the Lord. Geez, I swear, sometimes trying to figure all this stuff out. Okay, so if we're over here left of chart, this is the age of grace. So way back here somewhere, Christ was crucified, and we're moving along in history, and then here's the rapture. And with the rapture,
John, no, John, your cursor is not seeing that.
Cursor is not, okay, you guys aren't seeing my cursor then?
it looks like you have the picture highlighted. Click on your paper and highlight the picture.
That's all I know to do. I'm trying to mess around here and just see if there's something. Can you see the cursor now in the middle?
Hit your escape button, John.
Enter escape.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I've escaped.
It should take the.
Wow. Allows me to wiggle the thing around, that's for sure. Okay, let me do this because everybody can see my cursor over here. So can you see my cursor now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I don't know what that's all about, but in any case, you can see it on my laptop, but not on my second screen. Not a big deal. I'll just shift a little bit. Okay, so we're left of chart in the age of grace, and then here comes the rapture. And I used to be a little sloppy with this. I hadn't put things together as tightly as I have now. And I used to say the rapture started the countdown for the 7 years of tribulation. And that's not true. And what starts the 7 years of, because the church, the rapture is for the church, not for Israel. And so if we go back to Daniel, if you'll take your Bible and go back to Daniel chapter 9. And I'll tell you what, while you're going to, or sort of, you're probably already in chapter 9, but let me just run through the whole chart so that real quick, so that we have an understanding of what's going on. So we start with the rapture where we go up to heaven. And then we're up there during this space here before the 7 years starts, and then the 7 years of tribulation. This yellow line is when the many in Israel make a covenant with the Antichrist, and according to Daniel 9, that starts the 7-year countdown. And then the 7-year countdown, the 7 years of tribulation end when Christ comes down and fights the battle of Armageddon and conquers the earth. When he fights that battle, the beast and false prophet who are heading up the armies of the devil, they're thrown immediately into the lake of fire. And Satan is grabbed by a big angel and he is chained. And then there are two judgments that happen very quickly. One is the sheep and goat judgment, Matthew 25. We'll talk about that in more detail, but that's not well understood at all in Christendom for various reasons. So Christ, battle of Armageddon, sheep and goat judgment, and then the first resurrection or the resurrection of the just. And at this point and by the way, in the sheep and goat judgment, the sheep are allowed into the kingdom. The goats are immediately thrown down into the lake of fire where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. So now Christ reigns on earth, his millennial kingdom. He reigns for this period 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are over, I had to leave, technically this fire is right over at the end and the chair is, but you got to leave space just to have the little article things. But anyway, at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is loosed. He gathers up an army. He attacks Jerusalem. There's fire that comes down from heaven and destroys the devil and his army. His army is, they're human, so they're dead. And the devil and his demons are thrown into the lake of fire where they will burn for an exceptionally long time. The Bible speaks it by hyperbole to the ages of the ages. Now, just to clear up a point of confusion, it's often taught in Christendom that Armageddon is the final war. It's not. Armageddon is clearly the war that starts the 1,000 years, which you can see if you just read consecutively, Revelation 19, Revelation 20, Revelation 21. The reason that people think that Armageddon is the final war is, number one, they don't read the Bible, and number two, the actual final war doesn't have a name. It's just called fire came down from heaven and destroyed the enemy. And typically in theology, things that have a name, people latch onto and they say, okay, and they can put that in their head and say, okay, I got this, I understand where this is going. where things that don't have a name, they just kind of float around and get stuck somewhere. So the final war doesn't have a name in theology, and it's not in the millennial kingdom until recently has not been understood at all. And so this hasn't been known, but this is the final war. And then right after the final war, you have the end of Revelation 19, which is the second resurrection, which is the resurrection of the unjust, which is all of the unrighteous, unsaved people from Adam and Eve, literally up until that time, including the people who died in the millennial kingdom, the natural people who died of old age in the millennial kingdom, and the people who came to fight against Christ and died in this final war. And they get up at this second resurrection and are judged. And those who are unbelievers are thrown into the lake of fire, which Revelation 20 calls the second death. And those who are believers, like us, the people who get up in the first resurrection, and the believers who get up in the second resurrection, they go into the eternal city, which comes down from heaven and lands on earth. And at this point in time, things are totally different from life as we know it. And that's one of the reasons I believe there's almost nothing said in Scripture about this eternal city. What we know, for example, is it's 1,400 miles high. To give you a picture of that, we have satellites that don't fly even close to that high. So there's nobody that could, 1,400 miles up into space is space. So you can't have people living up there and breathing up there. And God says in Revelation 21, he'll make a new heaven and new earth. And it really will be. It'll be totally new and totally different. So that's what this picture is depicting. So that kind of gives you an overview of the entire picture. Is that pretty clear? Any questions? Yeah. Okay. All right. Then let's back up and let's, first of all, I want to show you the covenant with the Antichrist. Let's go to Daniel chapter 9. And in Daniel chapter 9, God is telling things to Daniel. And so basically an angel shows up in verse 22 of Daniel 9. This angel, actually who's Gabriel, as we see in verse 21. In fact, let's just read 21. Yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, he is called the man Gabriel, not because he's a man, but because he came in the form of a man, whom I had seen previously in the vision, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. And the evening offering would be about the time Christ died, or about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Verse 22, he instructed me and talked with me and said, Daniel, I have now come out to give you wisdom and understanding. At the beginning of your petitions, a word went out, and I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision. 70 weeks are decreed on your people and on your holy city to finish disobedience, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. And that the scholars are in good agreement, thankfully, that the 70 weeks, that a week here is not a week of 7 days, but a week of 7 years, which you can tell as we move forward through the prophecy. But basically, if I remember correctly, that's 490 years. And what he's going to do now is he divides this up. Verse 25, know therefore and discern that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem to the anointed one, the ruler, will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with a moat, even in troubled times. And the exact chronology of this has been very difficult, and the scholars argue about it. But we notice something right away. And that is in verse 24, the angel said 70 weeks. And then he says 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And what's the problem?
There's a missing week.
Yeah, we're missing a week. 7 weeks and 62 weeks is only 69 weeks. and this is talking about the Messiah, and I'm not going to exegete all the chronology here, but basically what happens is we're missing a week or 7 years, and the 7-year week is going to come later. And the reason it's going to come later, it's interesting because the people of the time that Daniel wrote could see in the prophecy that the week was coming later, but could not figure out why. And I certainly understand, because what did God do between the 69th week and the start of the 70th week?
Age of grace.
Right. He throws in the age of grace. That's you and I. So then what's going to happen is the 70th week will start. And here it's going to tell you when the 70th week is going to start. Verse 27, and this is verse 26. After 62 weeks, the anointed one will be cut off, will have nothing, and the people of the ruler who come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And if you note, the ruler who will come, that is going to eventually be the Antichrist. And so the Christ was cut off after 69 of the 70 weeks of years. And then when he was cut off, remember, it was only after he was crucified, there was only about 50 days between his crucifixion and the start of the age of grace. So that would be in the same prophetic year. So the year that Christ is cut off, we know that started the age of grace. And so then the 69 or the 70 week program pauses until the rapture. And then you have the months start clicking again. And verse 27 says, he will make, he is the ruler who will come, will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. And there's your 7 years. So that's the 7 years of the tribulation. So the 7-year countdown starts when the Antichrist makes this covenant with Israel, the many in Israel. And I think it says specifically, it's interesting when it says the many, because there will be faithful people in Israel that will not go along with this covenant, but they won't be the majority, and the leaders will push it through like they always have. But the Antichrist is going to make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, for 7 years. And then in the middle of the week, he will cause the sacrifice and offering to cease. And on a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. And we can read about that in 2 Thessalonians. So what you see then, back to the chart, is you see here's the 7 years starting, and you have the 7 years of tribulation. And then we have the Battle of Armageddon. And then we have the sheep and goat judgment. And to go there, we've got to go to Matthew chapter 25. So let's take a quick look in Matthew 25. And we're going to be in verse 31 of Matthew 25. And remember that it would have been much better for us Bible readers if chapter 25 had never been a chapter. Because in Matthew 24:3, the disciples asked Christ, what'll be the signs of your coming and of the end of the age? And Christ begins to answer them. And his answer is all of chapter 24 and all of chapter 25. But by putting a chapter marker at chapter 25, what happens is people read Christ's answer in 24 and then they think that's it. That's the end of his answer. But we've got to, you've got to almost like in your Bible, put a circle around chapter 25 and one of those little loopy signs that says, don't go there, because Christ's answer was from 24:3 all the way to the end of 25, which if I remember correctly is 25:43. So here we are in Matthew chapter 25, and what's the signs of your coming and of the end of the age? And he's completes stuff in 24, and then in 25 he starts with the parable of the 10 virgins. And what's the point of the parable of the 10 virgins? The point of the parable of the 10 virgins is time's going to move along and move along and move along, and then the bridegroom's going to come and the door's going to be shut. And one of the points that Christ needed to emphasize to his disciples is, don't mess around in your life. Don't think you're going to get saved later, or you're going to behave later, or you're going to obey God later. You're going to get serious about religion later, whatever it is. We don't know when the door is going to be shut, but when the door's shut, it's shut. And once Christ comes back for the Christians, that's the rapture, and everybody else is going to have to go through the tribulation. And once Christ comes back at Armageddon, that's the end of it. There's the judgment. And at that point, if you're judged unrighteous, you can't be standing in the unrighteous line and say, wait, I've changed my mind, because there is no change of mind at that point. The future is set, and you set it. So that's one of the things that we need to be aggressive about, in encouraging people to accept Christ and to change their life now and not try to wait. And that's the parable of the 10 virgins. And then starting in verse 14, Christ shifts the parable or changes the parable, and now he's going to tell the parable of the talents. And in the parable of the 10 virgins are, do what it takes to get saved now. And then the parable of the talents is, by the way, you're going to get rewarded for what you do with what you have. Every single person has a different talent, different things that they can bring to the table for God's kingdom, whatever that happens to be, according to your own personal ministry. And the person who just takes their God-given talents and buries it in the ground, well, then they're going to lose out on rewards. And so, if you look here, it's so interesting. Christ said, the disciples said, what are the signs of your coming in the end of the age? And Christ gives them some signs, and then he says, don't mess around and wait. And then he says, furthermore, use your talents so you maximize your rewards in the kingdom. And then he goes on with the kind of the flow. He'd been talking about the flow of events in the end days. Then he interrupts with these two parables to make those 2 points. And then he goes back to the flow in verse 31. He says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. And that will not be in Jerusalem, by the way. And you can read my commentary on that. But he's going to come up from the south, just as Moses came up from the south into the promised land. Verse 32, and all the nations will be gathered before him. Wait a minute, this is after the tribulation and Armageddon. There aren't a lot of people left, but there's 7.7 billion people on the planet right now. And even if the vast majority of them were wiped out, you'd still have at least probably several million, maybe several tens of millions of people that are left in scattered places all around the world. And in the book of Zephaniah, there's an interesting verse, because God wants to make sure that we understand that when Christ comes back and conquers the earth, there isn't anybody that's going to be climbing out from a desk somewhere and hiding, and saying, oh, you forgot me or something like that. There's a verse in Zephaniah that says God will search Jerusalem, Zion, the areas conquered by Christ, which is the world, that he will search with lamps, which, today we might say flashlights or something, but basically, in other words, the picture in the mind of the ancient person would be the angels walking around with big oil lamps and sticking them in dark corners and looking and making sure no one was hiding. So when Christ comes and the angels go out and gather all the people, it's not like any of them are going to hide anywhere and escape this. And he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And then of course the sheep are allowed into the kingdom and the goats are thrown into the fire of Gehenna. Now, when in preparing for this teaching, once again, I went back and did some commentary work on the sheep and goat judgment. And really, honestly, it is incredibly difficult to find anyone who understands this, and you can understand why. The mainline churches, the Orthodox churches, Roman Catholic Church, the standard Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist Church, believe that when you die, you go right to heaven. And if people die and go right to heaven, there really isn't a need for this sheep and goat judgment. And there's a lot of people that that even believe in the millennial kingdom, but they think that the tribulation and Armageddon is going to kill everybody. So I read commentaries that said the whole sheep and goat thing is a parable. I read commentaries that said the whole sheep and goat thing is a kind of a pictorial, pictorial story or whatever of the final judgment. It's really difficult to find somebody who understands that what's going on here is Christ is judging the people who are still alive after Armageddon and making the decision about whether they get to come into his millennial kingdom or whether they are a goat and they are thrown directly into the fires of Gehenna. And so that was our Battle of Armageddon. Now, as we go back to the chart, so here we are in the tribulation, and let's just take this all the way through. If we start back with Adam and Eve, and we come all the way forward through life, we're finally now in the tribulation. What is the situation on earth? Because when it is, here's your dividing line, the Battle of Armageddon, and back, left or earlier than the Battle of Armageddon, what's the state of the world? Well, the air is polluted, the water's polluted. In fact, I just saw a horrendous YouTube video on, you guys probably know, I think there's like a floating city in the middle of the Pacific that's all floating plastic that's like the size of Vermont or something. It's ridiculous, and all that plastic is breaking up, and it's becoming very, very tiny, and it gets in all the water sources, and it gets in the fish that you eat, and now it's getting in the animals that you eat. And they, in the YouTube that I watched, it was a Canadian firm, and they went to the grocery stores and they bought, and you guys have bought them, I've bought them. It's a big plastic thing that has probably 25 or 30 bottles or whatever it is, those little bottles of water, and they bought 5 or 6 of the major brands. I don't remember what all the major brands are. I remember that one of the brands was Fiji. But anyway, I mean, they showed all the brands. And then what they did is they ran all that water through filters and then ran it through some kind of scope that could tell whether there was plastic. And 30%, this is bottled water now that you buy in the grocery store, 30% of those bottles had plastic pieces from the microscopic to the just barely visible, like a pinpoint, but 30% of those bottles had pieces of plastic in it. And it was really spooky to watch, frankly. But I say this because we're talking about, here's Christ, and he comes down, he fights the Battle of Armageddon, and he gets the earth. Yeah, gee, thanks. If I were Christ, I'd look around, I'd go, yeah, well, God, this earth thing, you can have it. I mean, where can you go? There's mercury in all the water. There's PCBs in all the lake. There's plastic everywhere, including in the fish. There's sulfur dioxide all over the air. And the animals are mean, and the mosquitoes are driving me crazy, and the snakes are poisonous, and the spiders are horrid. And, and it's like, wait a minute here. This is a terrible place. I don't want it. And so the interesting thing is that the prophecies, you go back to the millennial kingdom, and the prophecies of the millennial kingdom is it's going to be paradise. And one of the reasons that the Bible doesn't make sense is because in the Old Testament it was Hebrew, of course, and in the New Testament it's Greek. And what that caused was it caused a disassociation in vocabulary. And so, for example, we read in Genesis chapter 2, Genesis chapter 3 about the Garden of Eden, E-D-E-N. Eden, what does that mean? The Garden of Eden, it's just a name. But in Hebrew, it means delights. It was a garden of delight. And when the Greeks got to it, they're like, okay, what's a delightful garden? And the Greeks didn't really have a good word for that, but the Persians did, because the Persian monarchs really liked what they called their pleasure gardens. And so their pleasure gardens would have fruit trees and bushes and flowing water, and it's where the higher ups they'd have their pleasure gardens, and they'd go there with their women and stuff like that. And so the Persians had a word, paradisos, and that was a pleasure garden. And so the Greeks grabbed this and used this as the transliteration of the word Eden. So if you read the Hebrew text, it says the Garden of Eden. If you read the Septuagint text of Genesis 2 and 3, it says the paradisos. And that becomes the Greek word then that was also used in the New Testament. For example, when Christ was on the cross and he was talking to the thief, and he says to the thief, you will be with me in paradisos. Or if Christ on the cross was speaking Hebrew or Aramaic, he would have said, you will be with me in Eden. And when Paul in 2 Corinthians writes and says, I was taken into paradise, paradisos. And then we see in the book of Revelation that there's paradisos. So there's a continuity here. The Garden of Eden is the paradisos, and that's the way the earth is going to be. So here's our problem. The problem is back here before the Battle of Armageddon, we have all these horrible things. Horrible air, horrible water, horrible animals, horrible snakes, terrible mosquitoes. You can tell I don't like mosquitoes. They really like me. Lots of poison ivy back here, by the way. Even if there's one plant, it's too much. I get poison ivy terribly easy. And all of a sudden, here comes the Battle of Armageddon. And on the other side of Armageddon, whoa, no air pollution, no water pollution, no pollution in the ground, no plastic in the water. Lions, here, back here, the lions are eating other animals. One day goes by and the lions are out here eating plants in one day. And over here, you got thorn bushes, brambles, briars, all kinds of bushes with thorns. Over here, no thorns in sight. No plants have thorns. The thorns and thistles came to be after Eden. So basically what you've got to do, you've got one day to completely cleanse the earth and totally remake animal nature. And now if we go back to Zechariah 14, then that's what's going to happen in this day. Because if we start with Zechariah chapter 14, verse 1, it says, behold, a day of Yahweh is coming. And of course, the day of Yahweh is talked about a lot in the biblical, in the biblical narrative. When your spoil will be divided in your midst, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city will be captured, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. I guess I can stop sharing here while we read all this stuff. Good to see all your faces again. So this day of Yahweh is coming, and then I'm going to gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half the city will go out into captivity, but the rest of the people will not be removed from the city. And this is a future battle. This will happen. This is why Jesus Christ in Matthew 24 said to his disciples, when you see, you're going to hear about wars close by, and you're going to hear wars close by and about wars far away. And when you see armies, then run like crazy. If you're on your rooftop, don't even go down into your house, because that army's going to move in, and this is what's going to happen. And this is future. It absolutely will happen. There's nothing that any of us can do to stop it. I got a letter in the mail today from a ministry that was, wanted donations and stuff to establish peace on earth. And I thought, if it was a donation for preaching to people, warning them, telling them to get saved, telling them about rewards, I would consider. But giving your money to a ministry that's going to try and make people friendly on earth, every prophecy is against you. And you are not going to beat the word of God. I don't care how much money you throw at it. It isn't going to happen. There's better ways to spend God's money that you've earned. So basically, verse 3, that this, by the way, it's this kind of verse that we're going to read that people use to support the Trinity, and I can understand
Don,
why.
I want to ask you a question.
Absolutely.
You're talking about the people being raped, and is that, I was confused on that. Is it during tribulation, after the gathering, or before?
No, that's during the tribulation.
Okay, so we'll be gone.
Right. Yeah. Yes, we will. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. Because this is after the Antichrist comes to power. And so we'll be gone for that. Yeah. Verse 3 then says, then Yahweh will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights in the day of battle. Now, when you read this, then Yahweh will go out and fight. Now, in the biblical world, they would understand this perfectly, but in our world, we don't necessarily understand this, and this confuses people. What does it mean when it says that Yahweh will go and fight? Is Yahweh going to come down and fight in person? No, he's going to fight through his representative. And you guys, you know, the biblical and particularly the Jewish idiom of author and agent, where somebody is said to do something, but he's doing it through his agent. And so this is an example of how we have to understand the customs that are being used to be able to understand the scripture. It's not that Yahweh personally comes down. We know from, for example, Isaiah 63, it's very clear that it's the Lord's Messiah that comes down. You read Psalm 2, God says to Jesus, the Messiah's Messiah, ask of me, I will give you the nations for your inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. You will dash them with a rod of iron, break them with a rod of iron, dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel, that kind of thing. All the verses, Daniel chapter 2, that the stone that's cut out without hand, that stone will crush the kingdoms of the world and then become a huge mountain that will fill the earth. Loads and loads of scripture that say that the Messiah is going to be the agent through whom Yahweh will conquer the earth. That is certainly the way that the Jews would read Zechariah. They would not think that all of a sudden God is going to bypass his Messiah and come down in person somehow and fight. But if you're ever discussing this with a knowledgeable Trinitarian, this is a verse they may pull out and throw at you that proves that Jesus is God, and you just have to know how to handle it and what's really going on in the verse. In verse 4, his feet will stand that day on the Mount of Olives that is before Jerusalem on the east. And remember that in the biblical world, they faced east. So the Mount of Olives was in front, meaning between the sun and Jerusalem. And that's true. The Mount of Olives is to the east. And the Mount of Olives will split into from east to west, making a very great valley. So, and then it goes on to say half the mountain will move north and half of it toward the south. And then it says, you will flee by my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. Yes, you will flee just like you fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Yahweh, my God, will come, and he will come in the person of his Messiah and all the holy ones with you. And so this is Jesus then. He is finishing up the battle of Armageddon. He is preparing the earth for the reign of God out of the temple in Jerusalem. And this valley that runs, and I'm going to have to look for this, but the valley that runs from through the Mount of Olives, straight from east to west, is the valley that the water runs out of. And I'm going to say that's probably something like Ezekiel 42, which is worth taking a look at. And if it's not, we'll have to go find it. Let's see. And it's not 42. Let's see. And it's not 43. I don't think it's 44.
Are you talking about the Valley of Siddim?
No, it's the valley that the water runs out of, where he goes and measures the water. I wonder if it was actually,
You're not thinking of Revelation, are you?
no, wait a minute. Gosh, what, okay, wait a minute. I got to go to Ezekiel 47. Yeah, okay. If you look at Ezekiel 47, and verse 1 says, he brought me, he is the angel. And the angel here, this is really a very heartwarming story, because Ezekiel's a priest, but before he got to minister as a priest, he was carried captive by Nebuchadnezzar 600 miles east of Jerusalem and set down, placed in a city that's about 40 miles from Nippur in eastern Babylon. And here's Ezekiel, and he'd looked forward all his life to getting to minister at the temple, and now he's completely displaced. He's not going to be able to minister. And then as he grows older, they know that the temple in Jerusalem's been burned, and there's very little hope that Ezekiel would ever get to really minister as a priest. And so of all the people in Scripture, God chose Ezekiel to show the millennial temple to. And so from chapter 40 to chapter 48, God is showing Ezekiel pictures of the millennial kingdom and the millennial temple. And so in verse 1, when it says, he brought me back to the door of the house, that's the house of God, that's the temple. A number of your versions will say the temple. In the Old Testament, I almost always leave the literal word house, because it's very important to make the connection in the Old Testament that the temple was regularly called the house, because Christians get confused in Acts chapter 2 when it says that there was a rushing wind that filled all the house. And one of the reasons they get confused about the upper room is because there's so many versions that take the word house and they think, well, a poor audience isn't going to figure out that this is the house of God, meaning the temple. So they take the word house, by it, and then they make it temple. And then people are reading temple, temple, temple all the way through the Old Testament. And then all of a sudden the rushing mighty wind fills the house, and they go, oh, that's got to be the upper room. But if you read the Old Testament as it is written, the Old Testament not only regularly calls the temple the house or the house of Yahweh, but even, for example, the temple of Baal, if you check your Hebrew text, is often the house of Baal. So it was just known that the temple was the house where the God lived. And in verse 1, he, the angel, brought me back to the door of the house, God's temple, and behold, water was flowing out from under the threshold of the house eastward. So you've got the temple. The temple is on the top of Mount Zion. And now you've got water, and it's going to flow from the temple eastward. And it says, and that's coming out, by the way, from under the altar. And of course, the front of the house was facing the east. So it's literally kind of like flowing right out the front door. And the waters came down from under the right side of the house on the south of the altar. Verse 2, then he brought me out by the way of the gate northward, led me around by the way outside the outer gate, by the way of the gate that looks to the east. And behold, water was trickling out from the right side. When the man went forth eastward with a line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits, and he caused me to pass through the water that was to the ankles. And he measured 1,000, caused me to pass through the water that was to the knees. Again, he measured 1,000 and caused me to pass through the water that was to the waist. Afterward, he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass through, for the water had risen, water to swim in, a river that could not be passed through. Now, the interesting thing is what we're going to see in the next verses is this river then flows out of the temple, and it's going to flow to the east. And what body of water is to the east of Jerusalem?
Dead Sea.
Yeah, sure, the Dead Sea. And so the water, it needs to be able to flow to the Dead Sea. But if the Mount of Olives is in the way, it's going to have to take a really circuitous route and go through the Judean wilderness. But if the Mount of Olives has been split to where there's a giant valley, then that water's going to run right out of the front of the temple. It's going to run right down the hill of Mount Zion. It's going to run right through that valley and joop, and it's going to go down to the Dead Sea. And he says in verse 7, the angel brings him to the bank of the river. Verse 7, now when I returned, behold, on the bank of the river were very many trees on the one side and on the other, which is nice because if you go there now, it's hardly a tree. Verse 8, then he said to me, this water flows out toward the eastern region, will go down into the Arabah. That's the Great Rift Valley that the part of the Great Rift Valley that's in Jerusalem, and that's where the Jordan River runs through. And it will go toward the sea, and that's the sea we call the Dead Sea. Into the sea the water will go that was made to flow out, and the water of the sea will be what?
Healed.
Healed. I mean, that's amazing. We talk about, okay, here we go back to the chart, and you think about the Battle of Armageddon. Going into the Battle of Armageddon, the Dead Sea is dead. In fact, it's quite dead. Right now, the Dead Sea is approximately like, I can hold up my coffee cup. If you have a cup of Dead Sea water and you boil the water off, you'll have 24% solid material left in your cup. The Dead Sea is 24% suspended solid. In a 1 16-ounce glass of it will kill you. You don't go to the Dead Sea and drink the water. It's monstrously deadly. And so and it's been deadly for a very, very long time, which is why it's called the Dead Sea. And so when we think about going into the Battle of Armageddon, the Dead Sea's just dead. And then coming out of the Battle of Armageddon, this water flows into the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea is healed. And it says, and everything will live wherever the river goes, and fishermen will stand by it. From En-gedi to En-eglaim will be a place for the spreading of nets. And the fish will be of many different kinds. Right now there's no fish. And like the fish of the Great Sea, which is the Mediterranean, exceeding many. And then it goes on. So this is some of what's going to happen, with this, this happening here on this unique day as we end the Battle of Armageddon. Let's go back to Zechariah chapter 14. And so here's the valley in verse 5. And then in verse 6, again, well, we're not really sure how this works, but it'll happen in that day. There will not be light, cold, or frost. But then there's not going to be light. But then verse 7 says it will be a unique day that's known to the Lord, not day and not night. Well, if there's not light, it would seem like it's going to be night. But somehow or other, there's not light, but there's not night. Yeah, this is going to be a really genuinely unique day, and how God is going to pull that off, we're not really sure. But by the end of the day, it says that at the evening time, there will be light. In other words, things are going to be restored. Verse 8, and it will happen in that day that living waters will go out from Jerusalem. We just read about the ones flowing east in Ezekiel 37. Half toward the eastern sea, that's the Dead Sea, half of them toward the western sea, that is the Mediterranean Sea. And in summer and in winter will it be. Now, why is that important in summer and in winter? Because the vast, vast majority of the rivers in Israel today are not perennial streams, they're annual streams. The vast majority only run during the winter when the winter rains come. And when it stops raining in April, then those streams dry up. And so, what to us seems like a kind of a prophecy that, the water's going to run in the winter and the summer. All of our rivers do that. Well, in Israel, the vast majority of the rivers don't. They just run in the wintertime. And so here, this is quite a prophecy. And half toward the western sea in summer and winter. And then verse 9, Yahweh will be king over all the earth. And that day, Yahweh will be one and his name one. And so, and then it goes on, Yahweh's going to be in the millennial kingdom. There aren't going to be any idols around. There aren't going to be any competitive gods. There aren't going to be any other religions. God's temple is going to be in Zion. Christ is going to rule as king and high priest. And, there won't be any other gods on the face of the earth. And people, the knowledge of the Lord will cover the world like the waters cover the sea. So that's let's just go to like Isaiah chapter 11 real quick, because when we think about what has to happen, I mean, we have kind of an instinctive. I think if anybody from the Old Testament was resurrected today and could see the mess that mankind has made of the earth, they would just be amazed that we even live here. I mean, because back in biblical times, I don't know where all these. I mean, like for example, you study diseases in the Roman Empire. They had gonorrhea, they had syphilis. They had 3 or 4 venereal diseases, and that was all. And they were basically all curable by modern medicine. Now we've got, something like 55 venereal diseases, because the viruses and stuff just keep multiplying, and a bunch of them are incurable. And so you have verses like Isaiah chapter 11, that you want to see what the world is going to be like. Verse 6, the wolf will live with the lamb. And I know there's the standard picture is the lion and the lamb. And that's because Jesus Christ is both the lamb and the lion, and the picture of the lion and the lamb picture both sides of Christ. But as far as the prophecy in the millennial kingdom, it would be the wolf will live with the lamb. And that's probably, frankly, a much more powerful picture than the lion and the lamb. Because a lion, when a lioness kills, she kills enough to eat. If there's a flock of sheep and a lioness, the lioness typically will kill a sheep or two and drag them off and eat them. But a wolf is horrible. They're no wonder God talks about, ungodly people being like wolves in the flock, because the wolves will just kill sheep after sheep after sheep without eating them. My wife and I, and it's amazing how many animals will do that. My wife and I had chickens at one time in our life, and we loved the fresh eggs. And one day there was one day we woke up and there was a dead chicken in our chicken coop, and it had no head. The whole chicken was there, perfectly fine, except it had no head. And I had no idea what would even do that. What comes and eats a head and goes away? And an old farmer said, I kept trying to find out what happened. And we were garage sailing the next Saturday morning, and we were out in farm country, and I was talking to this farmer about it, and he says, oh yeah, he says, that's a skunk. He says, we talk about people being skunks. A skunk will come along and they'll kill the chicken and they'll just eat the head and go away. I was like, it gives me a complete new respect for why you'd call somebody a skunk, And then we woke up one morning and every one of our chickens were killed. And what had happened was we finally found out, and what was their throats had been bitten open, and their blood had been lapped up. The chickens themselves were completely untouched, but all the blood was gone. And an old farmer just said, oh, that's a weasel. The weasel doesn't want the meat. The weasel wants the high protein blood. So the weasel comes in, grabs the chicken by the neck, bites its neck, the chicken bleeds out, the weasel licks out the blood, and then he just goes to the next chicken until they're all dead. And it's like, good gravy. You just don't know this stuff. And a wolf, verse 6, when Isaiah says the wolf will live with the lamb, and that's an amazing picture, because, the wolf would kill the lamb even if it wasn't hungry. At least the lion would wait until it was hungry. But the wolf is horrible, and say, the way the millennial kingdom is going to be, the wolf is going to live with the lamb. That is a tidal shift in animal nature that's going on here. The leopard will lie down with the young goat, the calf, the young lion, and the fattened calf together, and a little child will lead him. So the little child is wandering around with the leopard and the young lion. And the cow and the bear will graze. Their young ones will lie down together. The lion will eat straw like the ox. Talk about animal nature changing. The lions are going to be back to where they were in the Garden of Eden. Verse 8, the nursing child will play near a cobra's hole, and the weaned child will put his hand on the viper's nest and the viper's den. They will not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of Yahweh like the waters cover the sea. And if you go to Isaiah, I believe it's 32, Isaiah 32, and there's a lot of these scriptures. You know, if you go to my appendix on the millennial kingdom, I have a truckload of these scriptures. Verse 3 says, because it was so important to build a hope into the mind of the people, and that's still our job today, to show people how powerful the hope is. So in chapter 32, verse 33, the eyes of those who see will not be dim. You know, people won't be nearsighted or farsighted or have cataracts. Okay, well, yeah, we understand that for the resurrection of the just. You know, sure, when we get up, when you and I are raptured, we're going to be completely physically whole, totally perfect. And when people get up from the dead at the resurrection of the just, they're going to be totally perfect. But think about, okay, here comes Christ. He conquers the earth, and there are people alive on the earth who hide and make it through the tribulation battle of Armageddon. And all those people, remember we read Matthew 25, they're all gathered at the sheep and goat judgment. And the sheep who are led into the kingdom, they're regular people. They've lived through the tribulation. They've lived through the pollution of our world. They've got, mercury poisoning in their bodies. They probably, a lot of them have some kind of cancer that's already growing. They half of them need glasses, or their teeth aren't right, or, whatever it happens to be. And as they, you can just see people as they go through this day, this unique day, they go through the judgment of the sheep and goat judgment, and somehow or other they come out on the side and they're looking around going, oh my gosh, my psoriasis is gone. I don't need my glasses anymore. All my fillings are gone. My right knee doesn't hurt anymore. They're totally healed. And it was fascinating to me, Dennis. Because I was thinking today about how this paralleled the Exodus from Egypt. Because if you remember, I think it's Psalm 105, when it says that when the people came out of Egypt, there was not any among them that were feeble, or the more literal Hebrew is that stumbled. Everybody. So you get these people and they're sick in Egypt. And as they're leaving Egypt, in the process of leaving Egypt, the power of God is on them. And they all of a sudden, they're just healed. And they begin their march into the desert. And that's exactly, and here in your prophecy, you talked about, brought you up out of Egypt, the Egypt of your life. And I thought, my gosh, I was going to teach about that tonight, how this thing here, this unique day parallels leaving Egypt for these people, because they will go into this unique day being sick and come out on the other side perfectly whole. And so it says in verse 32:3, Isaiah 32:3, the eyes of those who see will not be dim. The ears of those who hear will listen. The mind of the rash will understand knowledge. There's such a huge percentage of people today that are on, happy medication, Prozac and that kind of thing, or antidepressants or sleep medications. And what a prophecy that if you need that kind of medication to function, and then you go through that unique day and you come out the other side and your mind is totally clear. You think logically, rationally, clearly. You can see, you can hear, your muscles work, your joints work. It's just an absolutely amazing time, and then it goes on and it talks about, the verse 15, until the Spirit is poured out from on high, the wilderness becomes a fruitful field. The ground is healed. The fruitful field is considered a forest. I read that a little differently today because I spent 5 hours on let's see, today is Tuesday. So yeah, so Sunday afternoon while Genevieve was doing real estate, I spent 5 hours weeding in my yard because of course we hadn't weeded all year. So I mean, it's not like I, I kind of waited too long until the weeds gained ascendancy, but it's like, I'm not sure I want my garden turning into a forest. I got enough trouble as it is. But anyway, but the wilderness turns into a forest. And then it goes on and we're going to be healed. So, in closing, back in Zechariah chapter 14, I just, amazed that, that I've really kind of gotten a picture of why God had to say that this will be a unique day known to Yahweh. I don't understand the light, cold, frost, not day, not night thing, but I understand that it's got to be a unique day. And then at the end of the day, there will be light. There'll be light in people's minds. There'll be light in the sky. The earth will be lightened. And we go into Armageddon with this horrible, defiled earth, air, water, soil, people. And we come out on the other side in the millennial kingdom in total paradise, complete change of the heavens and the earth, complete change of animal nature, complete healing of the natural human beings. So that is that's one of the things I'm excited about. And I was blessed to share it with you guys tonight. And I hope you were blessed to hear it. It's going to be really cool to look forward to.